All right, welcome to The Explainer. Today we are jumping into a really personal question. One that's been on the minds of Muslims for over 1,000 years. From an Islamic perspective, can our good deeds actually benefit our loved ones after they've passed away?
This is a question that really gets to the heart of it, right? It's about love, loss, and our deepest faith. So, can you, as a living person, do something good, an act of worship, and then gift that spiritual reward to someone who has passed on? To really get to the bottom of this, we've got to dive into the rich and honestly sometimes surprising history of Islamic scholarly thought on this very topic.
Okay, so before we get into all the different opinions and the debates, let's start on some solid ground. First, let's look at the points where pretty much all Islamic scholars are in complete agreement.
So, what are we all on the same page about? Well, first up, any good deeds that the person started themselves in their life, think of an ongoing charity or knowledge they shared, that stuff keeps benefiting them. Second, prayers made for the deceased. And third, asking God for forgiveness on their behalf. These things are universally seen as powerful ways to help those who have passed. And on these points, pretty much no controversy at all.
Okay, so that's the common ground. Now let's get to where the really fascinating discussion kicks off. The big question: can you today do a good deed, give charity, maybe fast a day, or recite the Quran, and then specifically say, I'm gifting the reward for this to my mother who passed away? This is where we start to see a whole spectrum of opinion. You see, historically, scholars have kind of looked at this from two main camps. On one side, you have the cautious view. These scholars say, hold on, let's stick exactly to what the sacred texts explicitly mention, like, say, paying off a religious debt like a missed fast. Then you have the generous view, which says, no, those texts aren't a restrictive list, they're giving us a principle. They argue that those examples show us that the reward for any good deed can be gifted.
And you can really see this split when you look at the early positions of the four major schools of thought. Look at the Hanafis and Hanbalis, they were pretty much yes across the board, coming from that generous position. But then you see the Malikis and Shafis, who are initially a bit more cautious. They were okay with gifting charity, but for acts that were more physical, like pilgrimage or Quran recitation, they drew a line and said no.
But here's where the story gets really interesting. These positions, they weren't set in stone. As we roll into the medieval period, the whole debate takes some really surprising turns that honestly change the entire landscape of the discussion. And the people who really kicked off this shift, two absolute giants of Islamic thought from the medieval era. And get this, they were from the Hanbali school, one of the schools that was already in the generous camp. Their names are Ibn Taymiyyah and his famous student, Ibn al-Qayyim.
So Ibn Taymiyyah's argument was basically this. He argued really forcefully that the examples we have in the scripture, they aren't meant to be a restrictive checklist. He saw them as illustrations of a bigger, more general principle. His logic was, hey, if you can gift the reward for charity or fasting, then by that same token, it makes perfect sense that you can gift the reward of prayer or reciting the Quran too.
And this is the historical twist that just makes you go, wait, what? The very scholars, Ibn Taymiyyah and Ibn al-Qayyim, that some modern groups who take that cautious view look up to, were actually some of the biggest champions for the generous view. They argued for the very position that many who claim to follow them today now oppose. It's a fascinating piece of history.
So, okay, that's the history. Let's fast forward to today. After all these centuries of back and forth and these incredible reversals, where do things stand now? What does the balance of opinion look like in our time?
This timeline, it's just amazing. It shows a complete flip. The Shafi and Maliki schools, the ones that started out cautious, well, over the centuries, their scholars gradually shifted, and today, the generous view is actually the dominant one within them. And then you have this small but really vocal modern movement that readopted that early cautious position. It's a total reversal.
And what that long history leads to is the scene we see today. The bottom line is the overwhelming majority of mainstream Islamic scholarship, we're talking around 85% across all the traditional schools, holds the generous view. The belief that yes, the reward for any good deed can be gifted to the deceased is by far the dominant position. The cautious view is held by a modern minority.
So what does all of this history and scholarly debate actually mean for us right here, right now? Beyond the academic discussion, what are the practical things we should take away from this?
Well, the majority view gives us a really wise way to think about it. First, when you gift a deed, you are transferring its specific reward out of love. Second, God gives you a completely separate reward just for the beautiful act of being generous itself. And third,
It's all about balance. It's a wonderful act of love to be generous with our deeds, but hey, we've also got to remember to build up our own account for the future too.
But maybe the biggest lesson in all of this isn't even about who's right or wrong. It's this beautiful principle of scholarly tolerance. It's basically about recognizing that on issues that aren't the absolute core of the faith, different, historically valid interpretations can and should coexist.
This history teaches us such a crucial lesson. The great scholars of the past, they disagreed on this, for sure, but they didn't go around calling each other heretics or innovators. They debated with respect. So the real takeaway for us isn't about trying to prove one side is right, but about having the humility to respect a position that has been a valid part of our tradition for centuries.
And so that's where we'll leave it, with a question for you to think about. Knowing this rich history of diverse, respectful disagreement, how can we remember the people we've lost with all the sincerity in our hearts, while also having that deep respect for others who might approach it just a little bit differently?